Hi-ho! Hi-ho!
Okay. I debated whether or not I should make this video because I really didn't want to add to the Snow White discourse, but then I finally saw it. So I decided to take my time with this one and let the Snow White hate train pass by so I can talk about it without drawing too much attention. And this might be a hot take here, but I kinda liked it. Like, seriously. Was it perfect? No, not by any means. There are definitely some things I'd change about it, and we'll get into that later, but I actually found it kind of enjoyable. It was fun and cute and charming, and definitely not as bad as I was expecting it to be going into it. I mean, it probably helped that the theater I was in was filled with little girls, but hearing them come out of the showing singing the songs and planning their Halloween costume even though it's April and saying it was their favorite movie ever, I don't know. It was strangely nostalgic in a way, and it made me really happy, but with that being said, that's not the point of this video, and that's not why you came here, so let's get into it. Extremely brief history time. I took a class on fairy tales in college because I'm super cool, and we spent a massive amount of time on Snow White, so I feel particularly well equipped to talk about this one. It's pretty tough to pinpoint the exact origin for Snow White because, like all other folklore and fairy tales, they typically start out as oral stories passed down from generation to generation until somebody has the skills, resources, and time to record it, and then they're credited with being the author of the original version. I'm mainly looking at guys like Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, and in today's case, the Grimm brothers. So when I say original here, I'm referring to the Grimm version of Snow White, first published in 1812 and then the final version being published in 1854. Religious bodies controlled a lot of the printing presses at the time and they didn't like the original version, so they made them change it. They did this a lot. Folklore and fairy tales are classified using a system called the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index, and Snow White and Snow White adjacent stories fall under ATU 709. Stories where young female heroines, oftentimes princesses, are cursed, oftentimes by a wicked stepmother and or witch, and are somehow rescued by the end. And yes, this is incredibly specific, but trust me when I say that there are tons of stories in this category from cultures all over the world and throughout history. And that goes for all other ATU classifications, which is a list that is also seemingly endless. Getting back to my point, this very first iteration of Snow White includes many of the hallmarks that are still associated with the story today. Magic mirror, evil stepmother, poison apple, seven dwarfs, you get it. Actually, in the original Grimm's fairy tale, the queen/witch attempts to kill Snow White 3 times, once with a Titan corset, one with a poison hair comb, and finally with the apple, all symbols relating to femininity, at least at the time. The corset, obviously an incredibly restricting undergarment that literally had health repercussions on the woman who wore them. The comb, meaning having long hair and accessories to dress them, was both a symbol of femininity and status. And finally, the apple. In the original story, it was half red and half white, where the witch eats one half which is not poisoned and gives the other, very poisonous part to Snow White. An apple, which has been a symbol of female punishment since the Bible's Adam and Eve. That's a TED Talk for another time, but interesting to note considering that most fairy tales were initially conceived to serve as a religion-laced warning for children. It would have been cool to see some sort of reference to this on the big screen, like maybe the queen disguises herself differently each time, such as the prince character or woodland creature, or maybe even a child would have been a particularly good trick for her to fall for, but we've got less than 2 hours to work with. What Snow White gets the most flack for from modern audiences is the quote-unquote non-consensual kiss that the prince uses to wake her. And that's a valid criticism, especially considering that the prince and Snow White don't really have a pre-established relationship in most adaptations. He just kind of shows up in the middle of the woods. The funny thing is, in the original Grimm Snow White, the prince doesn't kiss Snow White. The prince shows up, sees her there, and offers to take her back to his kingdom to find her final resting place. There's a debate going on whether or not it was simply because she's beautiful and the prince likes looking at pretty things, but that's besides the point. When they go to pick up the coffin, they kind of stumble a little bit, which loosens the piece of poison apple lodged in her throat, and that's how she wakes up. But I personally think that that's kind of dumb, so I don't really mind the change. But it doesn't end there. There's a whole nother part of the story after that where Snow White and the prince get married and the evil queen shows up to the wedding. When she does, they make her wear red-hot iron shoes and dances until she dies. I cannot believe that this was being published in the same era as Jane Austen, Mark Twain, and Charles Dickens. Moving on, perhaps the most famous and culturally relevant version of Snow White is the Walt Disney Animation Studios' 1937 film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which is not only infamous because it was good, but but also because it was the first feature-length, hand-drawn animated movie, so it has historical significance. It was a massive critical and box office success, but it didn't win any Academy Awards. My personal theory being that the Academy didn't really know what to do with it because it was so new. It was nominated for Best Musical Score, but lost to An American in Paris, and Walt Disney was given an honorary Oscar the next year. I don't think people realized how influential this movie was. It was so culturally relevant at the time that Alan Turing, yes, that Alan Turing, inventor of the computer and father of what would eventually become artificial intelligence, was obsessed with the poison apple scene, so much so that it allegedly influenced the way that he would eventually end his own life. Allegedly, again, his actions having to do with the fact that he was gay, and that was not cool back then. Gay men were seen as being too feminine, bringing us back to that apple being a symbol of femininity and female punishment. But I digress. There's literally so much that can be said about this film, and this section is already starting to get extremely not so brief. Since then, Snow White has been adapted literally too many times to count, and Disney has capitalized on their version being the best with toys, records, theme park rides, video games, and finally, the actual point of this video, the 2025 live-action remake. The latest of many live-action remakes of classic Disney animated films to be released and mainly tolerated by audience critics, not only because of its quote-unquote wokeness, but also because of its infidelity to the original. But my main concern about this criticism comes from the fact that Disney's cartoon version isn't even faithful to the true original. According to Jack Zipes' paper Breaking the Disney Curse, Disney not only picked what to include and what not to include based on the American culture of the time, but also based on his own personal tastes and beliefs. Not to mention it was written during the height of the Great Depression and features everyone singing and whistling while they work. He goes on to say that Disney's version more strongly reinforces the heteronormativity of a patriarchal society than the Grimm's version, at least in the presentation of Snow White as a character and the importance of the prince in the overall story. Another interesting thing to note is the title change. Much like the original Grimm's version, the live-action Snow White is just called Snow White, while the cartoon is called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I bring this up because, like the prince, the dwarfs play a pretty negligible role in the Grimm tale, so they're omitted from the title. They're pretty important in the Disney cartoon, so I guess that's why they're added to the title. I mean, in the Grimm version, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs strike up a deal. She'll do the housework in exchange for a place to hide, while in the Disney version, Snow White just does the housework without being asked. And this would seem like a good deal considering that she's a housemaid, but she's not in the Grimm version. That is 100% a Disney creation. In the Grimm version, the stepmother never made Snow White do any of the housework, at least not that gets mentioned. Additionally, in the paper Snow White and Her Wicked Stepmother, researchers Gilbert and Goubar argue that that should be the title, Snow White and Her Wicked Stepmother, because that's the main conflict of the story. While I don't necessarily agree with everything they say, I do think it's interesting to think of Snow White and the Evil Queen as being diametrically opposed, two sides of the same coin on opposite ends of the spectrum. That spectrum being how women are viewed by society at the time. One being older and without children, biological children at least, valuing vanity and power, being independent and a creative thinker. The other representing youth, innocence, passivity, and arguably virginity. There's this thing at the beginning of Grimm's Snow White where Snow White's mother pricks her finger before Snow White is born, representing the blood of losing one's virginity / only having sex for the sake of having children, but I don't really want to get that deep here. Hence, the symbols of femininity that the queen uses to try to kill Snow White. Traditional femininity, good, pitted against the unfeminine, or evil. There's also something to say about the symbolism of the glass objects associated with each character, the magic mirror representing the queen's vanity, and the glass coffin allowing other people to admire Snow White's body. But I've yapped for long enough, and that's not why you came here. Whatever resources I used and can find for free online, I'll link down below in case you wanted to do research of your own. Now, let's get into how I would rewrite / redirect the live-action Snow White movie. Like I said before, a majority of the main beats would stay largely the same. There are just a few things that I would change that I think would improve the depth, cohesiveness, and overall reception of this movie. Similar to how the real Snow White starts, we open on this book with narrated exposition. In the Disney cartoon, we open with a live-action book that then transitions into cartoon, so I think for this live-action remake, I think it would be cool if we started with an animated book and then transitioned into live-action, just to serve as a reference back to that. The opening musical number is Where the Good Things Grow. We learn about the kingdom of the Good King, aka Snow White's father, No, he didn't get a name in the official version, so I'm not going to give him one either. He meets and falls in love with the Good Queen, who is also unnamed, but let's get a little more backstory here. Maybe she isn't the queen yet. When they meet, she's the baker at the village bakery, famous for apple pies, made only using the apples in the orchard from their kingdom. They fall in love, get married, and rule the kingdom as the good king and queen. The queen starting the new tradition of baking her famous apple pies and giving them out to the village, maybe as a part of some festival or something like that. I don't know. Again, similar to how it is in the real movie, one day the queen is very pregnant with their first child and they get caught in the snowstorm and she's forced to deliver the baby in the carriage in the middle of nowhere. And they name the princess Snow White after the fateful night that she was born. Which, yes, I actually really like how they changed the origin of her name because, 1, literally no one has ever had skin as white as snow, including other adaptations of Snow White, and 2, it can also be a nod back to the Grimm's version where the queen dreamed about having a daughter during a snowstorm. Where we start to stray a bit further away from the movie is here. I would have the Good Queen die here instead of when Snow was 11 or 12-ish. Not only is her death easily explained by the lack of access to whatever modern medicine was at the time, but I feel like it's important that Snow White never knew her mother. The Good King would continue to lead as a fair and just ruler despite the great tragedy, and he and Snow would continue the apple pie tradition as a way to connect Snow with the mother she never knew. It would strengthen their bond as father-daughter. So when Snow gets to that tough 11, 12-ish age, the Good King feels like she needs a maternal figure in her life, hence the evil queen coming into the picture as her stepmother. This would be where the king gives Snow the heart necklace. Maybe it was her mother's, maybe it's just a sorry I'm getting remarried gift, if that's a thing. Also, I never really got the whole evil queen being, out as a sorceress, but I wouldn't mind it as much if they made a change like maybe the sorceress was visiting the kingdom for whatever foreign dignitary reasons, like maybe uniting the human kingdom and magical creatures, and enchanted the king into thinking Snow needed a mother figure and put a spell on him to marry her. Also, I feel like it's important to add a little bit more depth as to why the evil queen hates Snow White. I don't think that it's enough that she's just jealous of her kindness or just her beauty per se. The way I always interpreted it was that she was jealous of the king's love for Snow White, but she perceives it as, and it manifests in her actions of being jealous of her beauty or fairness. In this case, fairness meaning justness or goodness as opposed to just appearances. I feel like this idea is more often better shown in Cinderella stories. I'm specifically referencing Drew Barrymore's Ever After here. But yeah, the only thing that brings the king out of his enchanted state is his love for Snow White, because, well, true love in any form breaks curses and all that good stuff. So, for her plan to take over the kingdom to work, either the king or Snow White has to go, hence the king dying on his trip, and Snow White being forced into servitude to the point where the kingdom forgets that they had a princess in the first place. Side note, I really like this detail in the montage of the evil queen having Snow's haircut. It really plays into that dehumanizing, taking away of feminineness referenced earlier with the poisoned comb. It also makes this whack-ass bob look a little bit more forgivable. At least there's story merit to it looking so bad. But that takes us to the end of the exposition and the end of the first song and into the main story. 10-ish years later, Snow White is still a scullery maid working in the castle. This is also where we meet Jonathan for the first time. And another hot take, I actually don't mind this character difference. We know virtually nothing about the prince in the original, so, in my opinion, there was nothing to miss from them changing this. And also, nobody complained when they did this in Once Upon a Time. Just saying. But they could have done so much more with him. So let's expand on that. Maybe Jonathan's troupe of actors and musicians used to be just that. Performers and artists. But after things started to get really bad when the evil queen seized power, they started using their talents to resort to thievery because that's what they had to do to survive, so that's the life they live now. Maybe here Jonathan and his troops were posing as a royal court, with Jonathan as the prince, as some far-off kingdom in order to steal the queen's stockpile of, well, everything. While the dining hall is being set up for the feast, this is where Snow bumps into Jonathan stealing supplies, and Jonathan reveals himself because he's so gosh darn cocky, and also there's something about Snow that compels him to be honest. But Snow lets him go, neglecting to reveal that she's actually the princess. The next scene, the dining room scene, is fine, but I feel like they kept dancing around the point. The queen is putting the finishing touches on the table for dinner with the royal court when Snow White comes in and they have a very similar conversation to how it goes in the real movie. Snow suggests they bring back the pie tradition her mother started and father continued to show the people of the village hope and kindness, but the queen shoots her down. And rightfully should. It was incredibly naive for Snow to suggest something like this. She doesn't know how to rule a kingdom. Neither does a queen, but that's besides the point. The queen should have called her out for this instead of just insulting her with that whole diamond versus dying flower thing. I don't know. This scene was so close to being good, but they kept missing the point. Anyway, the castle guards come in, Jonathan in tow, and they reveal that the court was, in fact, a band of thieves posing as the court to get supplies from the castle reserves. The rest of the troop escaped, but they managed to catch their leader, Jonathan. The queen orders Jonathan to be executed, but Snow, in addition to having her identity as the princess revealed, tries to convince the queen to show him mercy. I guess it worked, because the queen says if Jonathan wants to perform, then let him be on display. She orders the guards to have him chained to the front gate. Waiting on a Wish would stay pretty much the same. I wish they made the lyrics and Snow as a character a touch more dreamier, or maybe even included an interpolation of one of the original Disney songs, but, you know, I like this song more and more each time I listen to it. Snow frees Jonathan and he escapes. The evil queen is enraged by this, especially when her magic mirror tells her that Snow White is now the fairest one of all. Waiting on a Wish ends, and the evil queen calls upon Snow White, where she agrees that the villagers might find it merciful to receive apple pies and tells her that her huntsman will take her out to the orchard in the morning. Snow White rushes off and the scene continues as is. The evil queen tells the huntsman to take Snow to the furthest orchard from the kingdom on the outskirts of the dark forest and kill her, bringing her heart back in this box. Hesitant, the huntsman agrees. The next morning in the orchard, the huntsman follows Snow while she picks apples and occasionally offers him one. The huntsman starts to get into position to kill her, but he can't do it. Side note, why doesn't she have a reaction here? Why does she just stand there? I don't care who you are. If someone comes at you with a knife, you get out of the way. I don't know, that's the only thing that really bothered me about this scene. Moving on. The huntsman warns her about the queen's intentions and lets her escape. The sequence of her running through the forest is fine, I guess, but I feel like they took it too literally. Her stepmother just tried to have her assassinated. She's literally running for her life. She's having a panic attack and is imagining the forest as this dark, scary place. It's only when she stops to break down for a minute, relatable, am I right, does she look around and realize that it's not scary. In the cartoon, I really liked how the trees weren't overly personified, like how she was imagining it. And I also liked how the animals were scared of her at first, because it lets her optimistic and understanding nature shine through even in the hardest of times, just like her father was after her mother died. When she arrives at the cottage of the Seven Dwarves, I was initially pretty confused as to why they changed where Whistle While You Work falls, because its original placement shows Snow's resourcefulness, how she uses the skills she has at her disposal in an attempt to build a bond and hopefully get what she wants from the dwarves. But I don't really mind this change, because I like the song with the dwarves being involved, and I feel like tonally it wouldn't have worked after the running through the forest scene. Plus, it wouldn't have hit the same if it was just a slightly traumatized Snow White singing and dancing with hyper-realistic CGI animals. It was a good bonding moment between her and the dwarves. I don't know, I'll forgive this one. Speaking of dwarves, what in the uncanny valley nightmare fuel is this? I know that this has been a major spark of controversy surrounding this film. Some little people actors say that roles like these are demeaning and stereotypical, while others say that any representation, even bad, is better than no representation, and changing these characters to 7 magical creatures or wherever we started is symbolic erasure. And as somebody who is not a part of the little person community, I am in no way qualified to definitively weigh in on this conversation. But as somebody on the outside of this debate, I can in all honesty see both sides having pretty valid points. Because of this, I offer 2 solutions that I feel are better than both where we started and what we ended up with. 1, hire little people actors and don't take jobs away from actors with dwarfism. They did this in Mirror Mirror, and I think it was well received as far as I know, because they made the characters of the 7 dwarfs fully developed and well-rounded characters with agencies and real personalities, not just played them off for laughs. Option 2 is we play into the high fantasy element and take a Lord of the Rings, Dungeons & Dragons route for depicting dwarves. And all of the magical creatures live in the forest, banished by the queen, a la Shrek. Going off of this, maybe Jonathan and his troupe could be bards. This could also explain the whole working in the mines for 274 years thing that Doc casually mentions. Which means that they technically are magical creatures, but that also means that the evil queen is technically a magical creature too, being a sorceress, which doesn't really make sense either. A lot more would go into the second option, and it might take away from the whimsical tone they were going for. Also, why is Doc so articulate? His stutter, though not the best representation for speech impediments and definitely played for laughs in the 1937 version, was a part of his character, and I never viewed a thing like that as a character flaw that needed to be fixed. If it's something you're insecure about and you have the resources and ability to, go to a speech therapist or something, all the power to you. But if you can't, who cares? Some people have stutters, what's the big deal? They could have used this as an opportunity to create good representation for people with speech differences, and then the thing with Dopey later on, I'm getting ahead of myself. More on that later. Anyway, back in the kingdom, the evil queen sentences the huntsman to life in the dungeons, or at least until after she can deal with her Snow White problem. I do kind of hate how they used the apple instead of the pig's heart or whatever it was, but that's a small issue. The heart admittedly would have been kind of gross in live action, but they didn't need to show it. They could have kept the box shut like they did in the cartoon. If you want to get technical, again, in the original Grimm's Tale, the queen asks for Snow White's lungs and liver to eat. Like, cannibalism. But whatever, small peanuts. Getting back to the musical numbers, All Is Fair is fine, I guess. I think this might have been an issue with the performance, not necessarily the song itself. After, she then sends the guards to the woods after Snow White. Back in the forest, the 7 dwarfs let Snow White stay, and they leave for work the next day. Snow goes back into the forest. I added a line in here about her collecting gooseberries to make a pie to thank the dwarfs for letting her stay. I don't really know what a gooseberry is, but it is a nice reference to the original movie. This is also where she runs into Jonathan and his troop again, and they have a bit of a squabble with some royal guards hunting for Snow. There isn't too much I'd change about this sequence. I pretty much like how everything plays out. I think Princess Problems is an alright song, but it doesn't make a ton of sense character-wise. Like, it completely, thematically does not make sense. I mean, Jonathan knows that Snow was basically being held captive and abused by the evil queen for at least a decade, and even though her beliefs are optimistic, she's not completely out of touch with what's going on. That's, again, a smaller issue comparatively. It's mainly the dialogue that bothers me. See, here's one of my main issues with how people talk about this movie. Snow's dialogue and the way the actors talk about her don't match with what actually happens plot-wise. She says she wants to stay and fight with them, but she never really fights. She uses her intelligence and resourcefulness, coupled with the relationships she's formed through her kindness, to win the battle. But the way she speaks, the way the advertising pushes this modern and girl-bossified personality, would suggest otherwise. She's a dreamy, innocent, and naive character. So make her dreamy, damn it! She never picks up a sword or throws a punch, because she doesn't need to. It wouldn't add anything, nothing good at least. See, the problem with strong female characters is that we've overcorrected the issue. When I say strong female character, it should mean well-written female character, not necessarily referring to her physical strength. The ironic thing is, giving female characters stereotypical masculine traits is not empowering. It's the opposite. It's saying that in order to be successful in this world, you need to be strong like a man. You need to think like a man. You need to be a man. In fact, every conflict Snow finds herself throughout this movie, she solves non-violently. Honestly, I would go as far as to say that it's anti-feminist to discourage and discredit this traditional, caring, optimistic brand of femininity. And it's kinda sucky that the media pushes this narrative, especially as somebody who grew up in an age of actually good, hyper-feminine, yet still capable characters that turned into some sort of girl bossification after the mid-2000s. Sometimes women need to be saved. Sometimes men need to be saved. Sometimes people need to save each other, and it's no longer a gender thing. Anyone can be damseled, you just need to avoid falling into the damseled mindset. I would recommend watching Overly Sarcastic Productions' video on this. It's good. And this age of girl bossification, this overcorrection, has given women a step aside, I can do everything myself mindset, myself included, I'll admit it, and it can be incredibly dangerous not being able to ask for help, both in a mental health sense and in a physical health sense in extreme situations. Sometimes people need to be reminded that it's okay to be saved, and it's okay to be the object of someone's affection, and it's okay to want that too. Anyway, I digress. Where were we? Right. A lot of the second half of the second act stuff isn't too bad, especially when you adjust for the changes that we made earlier. I wouldn't change much about the battle scene, or the arrow scene, or the silly song into a hand-me-to-hand sequence. Queen's guards are heard nearby, and Jonathan and his troops rush to lure them away. Jonathan ends up getting captured and taken by the Queen, where she interrogates him about Snow White's whereabouts. She eventually deduces where Snow's hiding. She rips Snow's necklace off his neck and sends him to the dungeons. The Queen goes down to her secret lair, chamber, lab, whatever, and transforms herself into the old hag and makes the poison apple. Something about this scene bothered me. I can't really put my finger on it. Maybe it was the blocking, or maybe it was the performance of the All Is Fair reprise. I don't know. There was nothing wrong with it per se, but it just didn't sit right with me either. Anyway, the next morning the dwarfs leave for work and Snow White is left alone at the cottage packing a bag because she and Jonathan plan on leaving in search of her father in the Southern Kingdom when he returns. That's something I forgot to mention before. There's this rumor that the Good King is being held captive in the Southern Kingdom, and Jonathan and Snow make plans to go find him to find out if the rumors are true. This is where the Queen, in disguise, approaches the cottage. She gives Snow back her necklace that she originally gave to Jonathan, and Snow immediately wants to leave to look for him. But the Queen, in disguise, stops her to give her the apple. Now, she says it's for subsistence on her journey, but what was the point of changing this from the original magic wishing apple? Clearly magic exists in this world, and Snow White is naive enough to believe this. She literally sang a song called Waiting on a Wish, so I don't know why they would change this. Maybe because having the old hag being a magic user would immediately link her to the Queen. Maybe because Snow being in love with Jonathan would mean she'd see right through the spell because true love. I don't know. I'm changing it back to the magic apple, sue me. Snow takes a bite of the apple and immediately collapses into a sleep-like death. This is also where we find out that the Queen killed Snow's father, the king. I thought this was obvious, but I guess we did need the definitive confirmation. Later that day, the animals rush to find the dwarves in the mine, and they rush home to find Snow's dead body and mourn her. Back at the castle, Jonathan tries to escape the dungeon, but the huntsman tells him it's useless, because apparently there's only one cell in this dungeon. But Snow's optimism seems to have rubbed off on Jonathan, because he's determined to get out, and he does with the help of the huntsman. The two of them escape, and Jonathan rushes back to the forest to find Snow White. The dwarves put Snow on a stone bed surrounded by flowers and a golden canopy. I do miss the glass coffin because of that symbolism mentioned before, but I agree that this makes more sense because who just has a glass coffin lying around? Jonathan arrives on the scene to see a dead Snow White. I think this scene is overall pretty good, but you know what it needs? I needed Jonathan to sing a hand-me-to-hand reprise. Are you kidding me? It would have been perfect. Jonathan kisses Snow goodbye, and she wakes up. She tells Jonathan and the dwarves that her father is definitely dead, and the group tries to figure out their next move. Then, the stupidest thing happens in the whole movie. A random, singular snowflake falls out of the sky and inspires Snow to rally the troops. This didn't need to happen. I'd definitely cut this. And then, Dopey talks? What? Why? I mentioned this before with Doc, but I'll say it again. Speech differences, including being nonverbal, is not a character flaw that needs to be overcome. I know they tried to play it off all cutesy by making him too nervous to speak because he wasn't friends with the other dwarves, which is a story issue in and of itself that I forgot to mention before. Like, seriously, they were so mean to him with that bowl of porridge or whatever fell on his head, but come on! This scene was so close to being good. Snow returns to the village in a totally inconspicuous red cape to confront the evil queen, followed by an angry mob of villagers who immediately recognize her as Princess Snow White, even though they previously forgot that she existed. Not gonna think too much into that one. The queen sees them coming and meets them outside in front of the gates of the castle. This gives Jonathan, his troops, and the dwarves the opportunity to sneak into the castle. The queen goads Snow White on and makes fun of her naivete and nonviolent nature, going as far as to conjure a knife, placing it in her hand, and asking her to stab her. But of course Snow White refuses. This next part feels a little too easy for me. What happens in the movie as it is now, Snow rallies the troop once more and reminds everyone what the good old days were like. And they just switch sides, just like that. And if you ask me, it seems more likely that Snow's words would only distract the guards and or rile up the queen, and this would be where Jonathan's troops and the dwarves attack from behind, like how it does really happen. This would send the queen over the edge, and she runs back into the castle to find them. Snow White escapes from the dazed and confused guards and follows the queen into the castle. The chase eventually ends in the queen's mirror room, where the magic mirror chimes in about how Snow will always be the fairest, and the queen brought her downfall upon herself, causing the queen to turn around and smash the mirror in a fit of rage. She's sucked into the mirror, turned to glass, and shatters as well, disappearing into the mirror's frame. The gang reunites, the guards and villagers are lifted from their brainwashed state because the queen is dead and her curses are broken, and Snow White is hailed as the true queen. A hop, jump, and a quick time skip later, we get a super duper and they lived happily ever after musical number to Where the Good Things Grow reprise, where we learn that Snow White and Jonathan got married and everybody eats apple pies. The end. That was a lot. And that's just the plot. That doesn't account for any of the production or post-production things I have gripes with. Starting with the casting. Rachel Zegler was... You can't see, I'm doing a chef's kiss. Her performance was so perfect and genuine and princessy. It was a real highlight of the film, both vocally and acting-wise. I really hate how the media painted this whole thing and blew it way out of proportion, but that's all I'm gonna say about that. This has nothing to do with the fact that us theater girlies from New Jersey need to stick together, and also I think we would be very good friends if we ever had the opportunity to work together, but I will just leave it there. I do wish that the dwarves weren't turned into these CGI gremlins, because I know a few of these actors and I would have really liked to see their performances, or any emotion from them at all, but no, I'm done ranting about the dwarves. Moving on. Jonathan was great. The queen... This was not Gal Gadot's strongest role. If I were casting this, I probably would have casted, and I know a lot of people are saying that the woman who played the evil queen in Once Upon a Time was a good option, and I agree, but I would have casted Anne Hathaway. I think she's at the top of my list for sure. She's got the acting and vocal chops, and I am desperate for her to do more musical work. Plus, I think this role would have been a fun graduation for her because she started her professional acting career as a teenage princess. Visually, I know a lot of people have an issue with the oversaturation of a lot of the scenes, and those are valid criticisms. Some scenes are a little bright and directly contrast the visual identity of the 1937 animation. But honestly, I'm willing to forgive this. Modern movies are so dismal to look at. They're gray and dull and blah, you know? Even the other Disney live-action remakes, they're so plain and boring to look at compared to the cartoon counterpart. Is it a matter of the medium? Yes, 100%. But I appreciate that they tried to make this one bright and visually interesting. Where's their sense of whimsy? Building off of this, girl, we gotta talk about this dress. It's fine. Could it have been better? Yes, definitely. But is it by far the worst thing about this movie? No. It's forgivable compared to a lot of what I talked about before. The top was too teal and the bottom was too canary yellow, and I don't like how we lost the bow. The shape's okay, but I would have gone for a look closer to the German Renaissance dress in a subtler color palette, and I feel like this look would have complemented Rachel so much better. And girl, that hair. Again, I like the story with the evil queen cutting her hair, but could we not have done anything more with it? Give it a little curl, movement, and don't hit me with the, it's not realistic, it was cut by a sword. It's literally a fantasy movie with sorcerers and poison apple and magic kisses. It's not meant to be realistic. And Jonathan. Jonathan was wearing a flannel hoodie and leggings the whole time. Like, come on! He's in an acting troupe and canonically has a trunk full of costumes that he carts around with him. We could have had so much fun with his looks. Especially when considering that he used his acting chops and his costumes in his thievery, as seen in the beginning of this rewritten version. Everyone else was fine. I know a lot of people had problems with the evil queen's looks. They looked a little tacky, but they were fine, I guess. I think it's an interesting and acceptable interpretation. Another side note, the magic mirror looks exactly like the magic mirror in Shrek. Am I the only one who noticed this? Have CGI mirrors not improved in the past 25 years? Could we have not done better? You know what? Whatever. Again, it's the least of many evils. And finally, maybe this is the early 2000s child in me speaking, but I needed a cheesy pop version of Someday My Prince Will Come or I'm Wishing /One Song, sang by one of the current pop girlies playing during the end credits. Personally, I was thinking Maisie Peters. I just think she has a really sweet, kind of nasally tone at sometimes that reminds me of the original Snow White vocal style. I don't know, just a thought. Overall, this movie was not bad. Not as bad as the quote-unquote marketing would lead you to believe, and maybe even how my review might make it sound. While I do believe that the biggest problem surrounding this production is the fact that it exists, I'm not a big fan of the live-action remakes in general, it does exist, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. No matter how much controversy surrounds it, the world keeps spinning, and it's not fair to judge a movie before you see it. I learned that here. I went into this fully expecting Rachel's performance to be the best part of it, and for it to be a girl-bossified disappointment. But I was wrong. It wasn't perfect, but it was fun, and it was charming, and that's all it needed to be. Maybe it's the optimist in me, but I think this movie had so much potential, and the way the media erupted and painted it in a certain way after a few out-of-context comments, it's just... well, let's put it this way. Claiming that an almost 100-year-old cartoon is outdated is objectively not false, even if that cartoon has major historical significance and is widely beloved. Whether it was intentional or not, the Walt Disney Company's greatest financial successes and the foundation that it was built on is telling women's stories. And the fact that those stories got so twisted and oversimplified over the years is disappointing. Overall, the important thing to remember is, 1, it's an interpretation of an old movie adapted from a way older fairy tale, and 2, evil queen, poison apple, happy ending, yes, that's all the same. But the heart stayed the same. External beauty does not reflect internal beauty, and fairness and purity of heart will always triumph over evil. That's the point of the story. Thank you all for watching this far. If you found this production to indeed be dynamite, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons to support my channel, where I make content not for the film bros, but for the film hoes. And feel free to drop a comment down below if you have something to add to the conversation, or if you have any video ideas you'd like to see me do in the future. All that good YouTube stuff. Or don't. I can't tell you what to do. Until next time, I'm wishing you a very dynamite morning, afternoon, evening, or middle of the night. Whenever you're watching this. I don't judge.